school shooting hypocrisy, black utopias, pregnant male emojis, and Godspeed to Billy Graham. Coming up next on The Dr. Duke Show. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is the inaugural Dr. Duke Show. And unless somebody smarter and better looking shows up, I'm your host for the rest of this hour. I'm also joined today with Katie Petrick from the Healthy Republic. Our first segment of the Dr. Duke Show is going to be the countdown, where we discuss current events and engage in a little byplay. Katie?
All right, so today we have three stories that are grabbing national headlines, and obviously the very first one is going to be the school shooting in Parkdale, Florida. All of us as Americans, we're horrified, we're stunned, we don't know what's happening, but it seems like all of the attention has been at the national level. But what about looking at the individual shooter himself, at the individual's perspective in this?
That's what really I find remarkable about this whole thing is that a local shooting happens. A lot of local people missed cues, right? The adoptive parents of this killer, of Cruz, they said they weren't aware of his violence. The school who ended up expelling him, the school who had all sorts of violations about this boy, the local police who visited the mom's house 39 times. The local FBI was warned about all of this. Nevertheless, the mainstream media has saw fit to completely ignore all those levels of responsibility. Most importantly, the level of the shooter himself, who we've heard nothing about, right? We've heard nothing about him. In fact, we know more about the kids who are protesting this now. We know more about policies. We know more about how the local community response was than we actually know about this kid. And so the emphasis seems to be here to jump right to the national. And this always happens when progressive causes are involved. They smell blood in the air. They literally smell blood in the air, these jackal liberals. And so this immediately becomes elevated to a national conversation. We forget all the other levels. We forget all the other responsibilities that were missed. We forget all of the human interest stories that work our way up to that, and we focus on gun control, right? The only answer to this is banning everybody's guns right now and immediately. And so from my perspective, you've got it exactly backward. The only way you can understand a tragedy like that is not to stop at the national level. Because when you do that, when you start at the national level, I should say, you lose sight of all the nuances and all the things that makes the situation unique and possibly avoidable in the future. What you get instead is one big collectivist push towards some social justice utopia. Start with the kid. Work your way up that way, and I think you're going to be much better off.
Well, and in this specific instance, this kid, it's not like this is the lone shooter. We have no idea why this happened or how this happened. He had plenty of evidence, his Instagram accounts, just his behavior at school. I have a quote here from one of the students who said, "A lot of people were saying that it would be him. They would say he would be the one to shoot up the school. Everyone predicted it." I mean, right in front of their face at the school level, they knew about this.
Classmates knew it, teachers knew it, school administrators knew it, local police knew it, the FBI knew it. Apparently, the only people who didn't know it were the adoptive parents are the only ones who didn't know it, right? Which is odd when you think about that. Even casual acquaintances of this kid knew it. And it is a problem. I mean, the idea here that we've already had in the first 48 to 60 hours, we've already had, well, he was a white nationalist. Well, he was involved with the NRA. Well, he was part of the Hitler Youth. All these things get reported. They never get retracted. As we find, as what happened in Las Vegas. Here we are, how many months after Las Vegas?
Yep,
we still have no idea what's going on. There seems to be this sense that the authorities the only things that ever leak to the authorities are things that help make a progressive cause. We never hear anything that would dispel those things, and there are certainly no retractions after the mainstream media leaps to these. He's a gun nut, he's a NRA guy. After all these things are completely debunked, they're already way up about at that national level now, where the whole narrative fits the gun control argument and nothing else.
Yeah, and with the gun control argument specifically, there's an article out there from syndicated talk show host Vicki McKenna, and you've been on her show many times, so you can talk about her. She reported that in Madison, Wisconsin, right now, they are just showing how students are so desensitized to what's happening around them that they would rather get rid of the guns than have any sort of sense of control in the classroom or in their school, and they want to get rid of the police officers as well. There was just a fight, they said, that required 18 police officers to come to their attention, and yet we're at the same time trying to get rid of the police in the school. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, that's right. If you look at what's going on in college campuses and even some high school campuses, you've got kids so terrified by police officers, all this anti-cop rhetoric, all of this Black Lives Matter stuff, where cops are the default enemy across the board, despite the fact that very few cops engage in anything like racist incidents. So you see on college campuses now, kids terrified to see police presence. If a cop's on campus, these kids feel threatened. These are the same kids that are arguing, basically, that guns have to be gotten rid of altogether. And that includes the cops. And so you have this weird situation. And this is, I think, where the problem you end up with when you start at that national level rather than dealing with events locally first. You'll get there. You'll get to a national conversation once you've pieced it all together step by step. But by jumping to the national conversation, this is exactly what you get. We ignore things like a fatherless kid. A kid who was an orphan, a kid without a stable father figure until way late in the game when he was finally adopted within a year and a half of his killings there. Somebody who was pretty unmoored that way. This is somebody who doesn't have a lot of friends, a loner. Somebody who was acting out in school so much so that they finally expelled him. Somebody who was acting out so much in his community that the local cops paid almost 40 visits to the house. These are things that if we stop and think about them, you begin to recognize that the gun, every one of those things that you take into account, the gun becomes less and less and less a factor. The gun is just the symptom. The gun is just the tool that when the final breakdown came was handy. And I get it. I suppose if this kid had no access to guns at any point, maybe there wouldn't have been this kind of a massacre. But there would have been something that would have been bad. And so by ignoring all of that context to jump right to the national issue, you're never going to fix these problems. You could ban every gun in this country tomorrow. You could go door to door trying to collect all the guns. And all you're going to do is take guns away from people who theoretically could have stopped things like that. You're not going to take it away from people who are hell-bent on engaging in this kind of violence. We've seen this all over the world where they've tried it. You mentioned Australia, who actually confiscated the guns of their people. Gun violence isn't really going down in Australia. If you want a gun bad enough, you'll get one. It doesn't help to take away guns from those who could theoretically stop monsters like this.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. So we're going to move on to a little bit lighter of a topic, I think. Black Panther came out this weekend, and it's breaking records all over the world for its movie, I guess, politics for a lot of people. So we know that Black Panther, it's a Marvel comic. It's based in Wakanda, which is a fictional place in Africa, and this man becomes king, and then he has to, beat his arch rival. So knowing what you know about it and looking back maybe at the comic book itself, how does this movie fit into the current narrative that we're seeing?
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the actual comic books. And what blows me away about this has become such a source of black nationalism, right? The idea that white nationalism is evil, Donald Trump, make America great, that's all racism. But black nationalism, black authoritarianism, the kingdom of Wakanda, right? Wakanda, excuse me. The kingdom of Wakanda is a monarchy, basically. Mm-hmm. It is not a republic. It is not a democracy. It's a complete patriarchy. As far as I can tell, there are no gay Wakandans running around, right? Very few no transgender ones running around either. No, not that I saw either. But the thing that blows me away most about this is the creators of this comic book in the 1960s. I said, I'm old enough to remember this. Yes, the creator of these comic books was a Jewish white man, Stan Lee, right? Yep. So this is a Blacktopia, once again created by a black Jewish man, Stan Lee, right? White Jewish fella, right?
That's what you're
Sammy
supposed to be
Davis.
thinking.
When I think of black Jewish people, I think of Sammy Davis. We don't want to go down that route. A white Jewish person, Stan Lee, who created this comic book character in the late 60s and gave it kind of a radical flair. But what would Farrakhan say if you had a white Jewish person whose entire story here has now being filtered down? You got a black director in the movie, you got black actors, but the entire vision is another white guy's. And so how is that not a form of cultural appropriation? The whole mythical world of Wakanda is made up by a white guy. And so the idea that you can put a black stamp on it is wonderful, but it goes back to my comment about Blacktopia, right? It's this idea that equality, peace, understanding, mutual inclusivity, that this can all be done by fiat. You have, as you said, an incredibly structured society, a society that is terribly undiverse, an autocratic society, all the things that African-American social justice warriors claim they're fighting in this country. When they see it projected for them on the screen, suddenly it becomes wonderfully empowering, and people want to move. One last thing. I thought it was really bad for little girls to want to be princesses. Yeah. Remember how social justice warriors, feminists have tell us for a long time, having your little girl dressed like a princess is a form of masculine patriarchy? Oh, but think about all the little girls now that are falling in love with the princess character in this movie.
Yeah, and that ties into, there's a guy out there named Damon Young. He's a columnist for GQ, and he has his own website called Very Smart Brothers. And he wrote about how the women, the princesses in Wakanda, now make all the women in his life want to be princesses. But an even more important article that he wrote is talking about how to get rid of issues you have with white people. And I need to read this quote because it's just too good. All right, so if you are having an issue with white people, bark at them. Like a dog, bark at them. Because when you are encountering, quote, problematic white dude who is speaking when there was no ask or need or purpose for the thoughts and opinions of problematic white dudes. How do you do this? Because I know you're wondering how you're going to go about this. Well, he explains this bark is not a purposeless bark. This isn't a Shih Tzu barking through the window at a squirrel. Instead, this would be an intentional bark, a targeted bark, an overpowering bark, a drowning bark, a Wakandan bark.
So you're telling me, and I really hope to God this is true, the kid who wrote that is black. The man who wrote that is black,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Good. Because you got a black person now counseling African Americans to lower themselves to the level of dogs so they can bark at white people.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if you've been paying attention, but we domesticated dogs about 120,000 years ago, which means we've made dogs subordinate to us, loyal to us. We've made them our toys, our playthings, and our companions. So if he's arguing that black people should become dogs in the presence of white people, that's a little problematic, it seems to me. However, being African American, I'm sure he can get away with it. The other thing that I find really interesting is if you look at the cultural symbolism of that, have black people bark at white people they want to shut up. Have black people bark at white people who are in their way on sidewalks, right? If that's what you want to do, that kind of takes us back to Bull Connor in the 1960s in Alabama, where dogs and hoses were turned on African American people, protesters, by that argument. Why just bark at white people? Why not just become a great big hose and spew all over them? Let's go full Alabama on this one. Sometimes it really is amazing that the so-called progressives of any race, they're just the so-called progressives of any race, creed, or culture, what they really want to do is go all the way back instead of moving forward. It's not progressive at all. It's terribly retrograde. We're moving back to anarchies, or monarchies. We're moving back to highly striated societies in this movie. We're moving back to authoritarianism. We're moving back to the tactics that we saw in the streets of Alabama, and they call it progressive. It's really not.
Exactly. All right, and then finally, we need to take a look at the political scene because obviously we haven't been doing that all along today. And we've been told this many times before, but in case you forgot or you just didn't know, President Donald Trump is the worst. And now the New York Times is informing us that indeed, out of the 44 presidents that we have had, Donald Trump is the worst. Now, he's been in office for 1 year, and according to 170 members of the American Political Science Association, Presidents and Executive Politics section, they did a ranking of presidents. So you had a scale from 0 to 100, 0 being the worst, 100 being the best. How do you rank each and every president? And they came out that President Donald Trump got a 12 out of 100, and Lincoln, who got the highest, got a 95. So what are your thoughts on finding that one out? Well,
anytime you cite political scientists or political science professors as a source for information, you have to recognize that that's probably generous. I'm surprised they didn't rank them at 100, just assuming that the next 40, 50 would be better. So we take the source with a bit of a grain of salt. The really disqualifying thing to me is that after 1 year in office, they can decide that he's the worst president ever. After 1 year in office, and I think the better judge of Trump historically, and I'm not a political scientist, heaven forbid, but after 1 year, look at what was predicted 1 year ago when he took office. What was predicted was collapse of markets. What was predicted was immediate war. What was predicted was all sorts of things that didn't happen. It seems to me that when Obama became president, all these glorious things were predicted. Remember when he told us that the sea levels were going to lower just because of his presence? Didn't happen. So much of what Obama said was going to come with his presidency never did. Even though Obama, I believe, is in the top 10, right, of that list. Of course he is.
He always is.
Of course he is. He always will be.
He will be from
will
now
be
on.
Perpetually. If political scientists are the one making the decision. But with Trump, all the things the media said was going to happen, in fact, none of them happened. Almost none of the horror scenarios that they predicted happened. To me, you'd almost have to rank him, certainly at the very least above Obama for the first year, based on that alone.
Yeah, and if we were able to take the actual ranking after everyone's first year, but that's not how this study works. It's an every 4-year study. So obviously, when you look at a president's 1 year, it's either going to be, oh, wow, he did one really amazing thing, or he did a couple good things, which in our instance, President Trump has done, but you can't just look at 1 year when he has 3 more to go.
It's a completely meaningless study. It's one that simply virtue signals, right? Here we are arbitrarily ranking presidents. And you know, in looking at the study, it's obvious that Richard Nixon jumped up one spot.
There you go.
Of course, that's now that Trump's at the bottom. Even Nixon gets a bump up. All this is an attempt to either praise or vilify the sitting president. With Obama, he was overranked because, of course, he had to succeed because liberal hopes and fears and fantasies depended on it. It was the closest thing we got to Black Panther without there actually being a Black Panther. Meanwhile, the same goes for Trump. He has to be at the bottom, and he'll stay at the bottom for a long time, probably until the next Republican president is elected, should that ever happen, at which point that person, while they're in office, will be below him. That's just the way it works.
Yep, we'll see how it goes. All right, so let's take a look now at 2 questions I get to ask you because I'm just a curious person and I want to know things. So, we've been talking today about Black Panther, specifically, and comic books and all the Marvel movies. So I was thinking, what superhero power do you wish you had?
Ooh, do I wish I had superhero power? I guess it would be the power to completely ignore the chattering classes. I wish I could turn on the TV and listen to them ramble at MSNBC and keep my blood pressure stable. I don't know what that would call that. Immunity power, right? Something. I could see Rachel Maddow's face and not just see red, right? I wish I had the ability to suffer fools gladly. I don't, unfortunately, but I would love to have that one.
That'd be interesting. Okay. This is actually a part 2, so I'm cheating a little bit. But part 2, what is your actual superhero power?
The power to unilaterally annoy my wife. I mean, it's. I think that's probably a big one for me. I mean, I can do that. Yeah, I think most of us have that. It's one of those patriarchal imbalance things, right? That we have the ability to annoy our wives, even with the best of intentions. So I should have a costume for that.
I'm sure we could come up with one.
Maybe you got the Argyle. I mean, I'm not going to steal that look from you. Heaven forbid I steal that look from you.
How dare you? All right.
It didn't work for socks, honey.
I tell you. All right. So another question is actually another story I was looking at. So there's a story out of Australia that is pushing to have a pregnant man emoji. So think of a pregnant man emoji. So it got me thinking, what kind of emoji best describes you? Well,
before we do that, I know that our producer Mike has thrown up a picture on the screen for the moms and dads at home, a picture of the pregnant guy emoji. And I just love the fact that the creators of this emoji combined Bob Ross and Mr. Rogers to get the face there. I mean, you couldn't find a more effeminate combination if you try, unless you somehow worked Richard Simmons into the picture there. And I love the fact that his boobs are just as big as the 2 female emojis on either side of him. Love that. And so this male pregnant Arnold Schwarzenegger daddy daycare kind of emoji. That's what we need
purple now. Too.
He's wearing Barney purple. That's exactly right.
Here's the thing. He is, in looking at him, he's not so much pregnant as he is just super stuffed from having hit the all-you-can-eat buffet on Friday night.
Yeah, that's really Golden Corral guy
that
emoji
is Golden
is
Corral.
What that is.
Ponderosa,
they like to make it think it has something to do with pregnancy, but it's
right. It's I'm stuffed and I'm about to burst out.
All I know is this: the first time I hear a male pretending to be pregnant tell me that his nipples are sensitive, that's the moment I punch him in the face.
There you go.
But nothing I can do about it.
All right, but back to the question at hand. Which emoji would best describe you?
Whatever emoji it is that makes fun of the one you just saw, that would be me.
Okay, we'll work on that. We'll see if Unicode can come up with its
that's
own
right.
emoji for you.
Bald guy in a recliner with a big can of soda, laughing at that guy. That's all you. That's exactly right.
Well, it looks like pretty much that's all the time you gave me, so thank you, Dr. Duke.
Thanks, Katie, and you can zip away now.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
I decided I needed to get to the bottom of understanding how technology and my kids were interacting.
Unfortunately, a lot of parents are saying just do whatever you want.
50% of kids feel they're addicted to their social media.
Yeah, if you're a kid with a smartphone, you could look up anything you want.
It's a free-for-all. You can look at pornography. There's constant reinforcement, pings, tings, new friends.
I got to create my life the way I want it to be seen. It wasn't my true reality.
My daughter has tons of Instagram friends, but she has no friends.
They're more like strangers that have been identified.
They call it like fatty. You're just so dumb. The words they start giving you is the words you believe.
That becomes their life, their social media world. But that world can be quickly upended.
I had a gun at my head.
I'm very pleased to welcome actor, producer, Christian activist, and advocate Kirk Cameron. Kirk, the success of your films, Monumental and Revive Us, demonstrates a deep cultural hunger for more faith and family-based programming. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. It's so good to be talking with you and so appreciate the work that you're doing. So this is an excellent divine appointment in my opinion this morning.
Thank you. And your latest project takes on an eye-opening look at the dangerous impact of social media on our kids. It's called Connect, Real Help for Parenting Kids in a Social Media World. And it can be viewed in theaters nationwide on February 27th and March 1st. How did you come to tackle such an important and under-considered issue?
Well, it's getting a lot of attention in the news right now. If you turn on your computer and you start Googling social media, you'll find out that the founding president of Facebook, along with Apple shareholders and Google designers, are all talking about the impact that social media and technology, and too much of it, is having on our kids and the development of their brain. Now, let me back up for just a minute and say, how cool is it that we get to talk on Skype right now? We're using the very technology that we're talking about. We're using social media platforms to let people know that we have some important things to discuss. And so my wife and I are pro-technology, but like anything that's powerful, whether it's a gun or it's an automobile or a laser or Facebook, we have to learn how to use it responsibly, because that kind of power combined with unhealthy habits can cause a lot of damage. And so this movie really was birthed out of my wife and I getting our kids smartphones and wanting to teach them how to use it. And when we started doing that, we started realizing all of the pitfalls that parents can fall into with their kids. And we really are a guinea pig generation. We're the pioneer parents who are figuring this out for the very first time. So when you see your kids spending too much time on their phone or their device, or you're wondering why they feel so entitled, why they appear so narcissistic, and why kids are experiencing anger, anxiety, depression, and you're concerned about the ability to view content that was never before possible for an 8-year-old to see unless you had a really rotten friend of a big brother or an uncle who would bring something to your house in secret. Now it's in reach at the tip of their fingers with a device that looks like this. So my wife and I feel the same burden that millions of parents feel, and that is, how do I help my kids navigate through this social media digital world in a way that they become champions with technology rather than victims of technology?
Kurt,
That's what Connect is about.
I really love what you said there about pioneer parents. We have this tendency to think that parenting is an accomplished art. We've been doing it for thousands of years, and so we should know all about it. But this is a huge challenge for us. And we know that everything the Lord makes, and this is where Christianity and our Christian values, I really think can help moms, because it is a hallmark of Christianity that everything the Lord made, including the internet, including technology, all that stuff is good. But like every other good thing God made, if you don't use it right, it becomes a really grave danger. And Christianity and Christian balance, I think, can really help parents to get a handle on what the positive and the negative impact is. And speaking of which, can you share either with your, an anecdote with us, either with your own kids' use of cell phones or in the movie? The trailer is just eye-opening and shocking. Share with us a couple of examples of how this technology, social media, can be used to really negatively impact our kids.
So if we want to talk about a couple of the negative impacts, I think it's actually so obvious that if anyone watching this has parents, I probably don't even need to detail it for you, right? Are you concerned about how much time your kids are spending looking at a screen? Are you concerned about the people that they're talking to that you probably don't even know, and what they're saying and how they're shaping your child's worldview? Are you concerned about the kind of content that they may be viewing either on their phone or on a friend's phone at school? So we share these things, and my wife and I do too. We have 6 kids. We decided we wanted to not be damage control parents. We wanted to get off the defense, get on the offense, and get educated with all of the new and emerging technology. We want to understand how it works and then be empowered to stay connected with our children and guide them to navigate through these social media and technology waters so that they can develop the healthy habits that they need as adults to go into the world out from under our parental protection when they themselves are adults and be able to raise their family and function and be successful. You know, nobody wants to fail at family. I know you don't, I don't. We have one shot at raising our kids. And so we want to do the very best that we can. And our efforts will help the next generation because, like we said, we're figuring this out as we go. No one's ever done this before. You and I can't ask our parents, how did you handle it when I had a cell phone as a kid? We didn't. They didn't handle it. We're figuring this out right now.
One of the grave dangers, it seems to me, is that the promise of certain social media is unconditional, uncritical acceptance. One more follower, one more ping, one more approving thumbs up. The problem with that is, as we know, that parenthood is not just about being your kid's friend and supporter. Sometimes it's about being critical or offering your kids alternatives or holding your kids accountable for things that they say and do. It's not about being friends all the time. And in some ways, you can see why the pull of social media is so much away from parents, because the hard part of parenting, the discipline, the responsibility, trying to educate kids even when they struggle a little bit against the values we're trying to give them, they get they seem to get this unconditionality from the phone. How do you in the movie suggest we balance that out? What can we do in the home to balance out what they're seeing on their screens?
In a nutshell, be a parent. Don't try to be your kid's pal. A parent is infinitely more important and meaningful than being a buddy that your kid likes. And that by no means is to say that we don't want our kids to love us, to respect us, and to like us, and for us to have fun and to enjoy our kids. Of course we do. I think you brought up a really good point. Kids get on the internet, they can receive unconditional acceptance, and yet they know intuitively that that kind of acceptance and approval is very shallow, and it can change on a dime. It can be upended instantly. And the kind of disapproval that kids and adults receive on the internet through social media networks can be catastrophic. So, for instance, the idea of bullying, the idea of peer pressure and criticism. It's one thing when we were kids to go to school and someone said you're dumb or you're stupid or you're fat or you're ugly or whatever, and a couple of kids might laugh at you and you go home and you're able to talk to your mom or your dad who can give you a better perspective and has wisdom on these subjects. And you know, you go through the school of hard knocks and you learn to deal with these things. But what happens when someone says those things on social media and 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 of your friends start cracking jokes and pick up on this kind of peer pressure and herd mentality? It can be devastating to kids. So what is most important, I think, and this is the message of Connect, is parents, be fully engaged parents, present and connected with your children, and lead by example. They desperately need what you have, wisdom. Have FaceTime, real face-to-face time with your kids. Help them to see the value and the superiority of real-world friendships, relationships. Let them see that between you and your spouse, you and your kids. Take time to be with them, listen to them, impart your love and wisdom to them. And when they make mistakes, let them know that you make mistakes too. We're learning together. I'm for you. I'm with you. And there's nothing that you could ever do to make me not love you. And we're going to get through this social media stuff, this digital stuff, and we're going to use it for good, not for bad.
Kirk, on behalf of our families and our followers, I really want to thank you for your commitment to produce and distribute values-based media and entertainment. Yours is a rare and much-needed voice in our increasingly unmoored culture. Thank you so much today for joining us. Best of luck with your film. We will be watching.
Oh, brother, God bless you. Thank you. I so appreciate the work that you're doing, and it's an honor and a privilege to be brother in arms with you.
We love having you here. And Mom and Dad America, you can catch Kirk's important film, Connect, Real Help for Parenting Kids in a Social Media World, in theaters nationwide on February 27th and March 1st. Let's fill these theaters and send a message that the heart of America still beats strong for our kids' welfare. Visit connectmovie.com for great resources and tickets.
The Lord Jesus on the door. Nobody gets to the sheep except through me.
It's never too late. There's never been a generation like it. We're blazing a new trail. We are the pioneer parents.
We spend a lot of time talking to experts when it comes to the problems in American education. Teachers, administrators, activists. We spend far too little time talking to actual students. And so I did just that. Spoke to a very articulate student about what's going on in American public schools right now. Her name is Sarah Russell. Spoke to her earlier today. I've talked to a lot of people lately, but this is one of my favorite guests I can think coming up. I can tell already. She's Sarah Russell. She's a 17-year-old high school junior in Indiana, and I love this girl's spunk. She is willing to actually say things and speak out for her conservative values in ways that conservative professors and conservative college students will not. They're cowering in their dorm rooms and their faculty lounges, and we've got Sarah here today. Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, your story is such a rich one. There's so many things you've experienced. Start by telling us a little bit. What's it like to be a conservative, a vocal conservative high school junior in a pretty red state, Indiana, in spite of that? What's it like day to day for you as a conservative kid?
Well, it's kind of lonely. I lost friends, and I am kind of a social outcast at this point. But, you know, I've been able to find people who actually care about me, so that's been one good thing that's come of this.
Well, we know, right, to be committed to the truth, to be true to yourself, these are isolating things, unfortunately, in our culture. Let me guess, how many of these people that have rejected you, how many of these people that have frozen you out on your school campus, how many of them have ever bothered to approach you to help try to understand what you think about issues? Do you get that, or is it more they find out you're conservative and that's the end of it?
Well, it goes, both of those things happen. Sometimes people will come to me just to pick a fight, and then they decide they don't like me. And some of them just will hear stuff from other people at school, and then they just assume that they don't like me.
Well, you have had some interesting experiences. Talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your speech class. This was an interesting story. Tell us a little bit what happened to you in your high school speech classroom.
Yeah, thankfully I'm not in that class this semester. Our textbook was very interesting. One of the very interesting pages was an entire page devoted to different gender pronouns. Like, there was actually a box that had a list of gender pronouns, and it gave a bunch of different definitions of gender versus, you know, biological sex, and then it gave some advice to teachers about how to deal with transgender students.
And what did any of that have to do with an actual course in speech?
Well, I mean, they have to police your speech, of course.
So, all right. So, in other words, they're using speech class. And one of the points we've made time and time again with all of this revolution in education, Common Core, politicizing of education, is that was going to happen. In every class, whether it's English, history, social studies, speech, gym, there's going to be an excuse why you have to teach kids about sex, about gender, about homosexuality, about transgenderism, about global warming, and they can squeeze it in pretty much anywhere. How did you respond to this assignment? Did you engage your teacher or your classmates about it?
I've engaged classmates in the past about this kind of subject, but I had already engaged this teacher about the wage gap earlier that year, and then he stopped liking me, so I figured that I might not get involved in this one.
So again, speech class, and you're talking about the made-up feminist argument about wage gaps. How did that come up in a speech class?
He decided that it would be beneficial to bring it up like 4 times in one lecture that I think was about like history of communication. So I'm not sure what that had to do with anything.
Right. And you know, I remember from my college days, this is a long time, before you were born, I'm sad to say. I remember from my college days taking a mandatory speech class, and the professor made all the speeches about very, very radically liberal issues like a wage gap. And if you were a student who got up and used facts and reason and economics to argue that in reality there really wasn't a wage gap, your grade was docked and lowered. And if you didn't have much on your side other than emotion and feminism, and you argued in favor of the reality of a wage gap, you got better grades. Is anything like that happen to you as well?
Well, last year in English, second semester, I had engaged in a conversation when we were doing a practice standardized test, and somehow halfway through the standardized test, it came up because the prompt that we were doing was extremely biased. And so I just kind of snickered at the beginning and then moved on. And then about halfway through, somebody decided to engage me about it. And then I ended up with, I kid you not, 13 girls screaming at me about rape culture. And the teacher just sat there and did nothing. And past that point, I got C's on everything. And then I had an essay that I wrote about the Scarlet Letter, and I talked about Christianity and Bible references and things that had to do with that. And I ended up getting a C on it because it wasn't appropriate for school.
Right. So you read a book that's steeped in Christian ideology. It's ironic to me. You think about a book like The Scarlet Letter. One of the reasons that book is picked in high schools is because it gives liberal professors a chance to attack Christian values, right? The Christian values of the Puritans. Here you are in that very class reading that very book, and your big sin is that you took the time to explain the Bible background of that book to your classmates. And for that, 13 girls started screaming at you and the teacher did nothing. I thought, Sarah, and this is going to be a terribly sarcastic question, I thought that public school, high school classes had to become safe spaces where there were no yelling, there was no bullying, there was no group beating down of other people's opinions. But I guess if you're a conservative, that kind of bullying is not just accepted, it's encouraged. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. And the hypocrisy of all of this. I have long maintained that the biggest bullies on American high school campuses, it's not other kids, it's not the curriculum, it's not people stealing people's lunch money, it's these Orwellian cultural moves on the part of the left to shut down speech that disagrees, to shut down any kind of speech that has Christian or conservative overtones. And the fact that your teacher could basically suggest to you, right, that writing about the Bible in a book that's steeped in the lore and the language of the Bible is somehow inappropriate for public schools, but allowing girls to screech at you because of your attitude towards the largely inflated notion of rape culture in this country, that's allowed to stand unchallenged.
Correct.
And so you also mentioned to me, we talked before the show a little bit, you had a history professor that was pretty, well, and this doesn't surprise anybody in the least, but your history professor was a little bit, let's just say, ideological in his approach. Tell us that.
Well, it is actually a girl, and she has one of the biggest things that she continually brings up is the wall. Everything is about the wall. We are paying for stuff in the Cold War, and it's way too much, like the wall. Or, like presidents are being overbearing, like Trump with the wall. Right, and so how does she basically manages to work her contemporary political objections to Donald Trump's wall? She basically uses that as the template with which she views all former history. She's always able to bring that back in? Right, yes. Does she ever explain to you why she opposes the wall, other than the fact that it's over the top or extreme? Does she ever explain to you what her objections are with the wall? Well, I actually ended up talking to her after class about it, and I asked her what she had against the wall, and her only response was it's too expensive. Okay, so expenditure. This is interesting. I assume, as we've mentioned, your history teacher is a good progressive leftist, so it's too expensive. No argument about how Obamacare was too expensive. No argument how we spend more and more money on education every year for worse and worse results. We spend more money. We funnel more money into teachers' unions like the one she's a part of and get less and less in terms of actual results from our kids. Nothing from that?
No, I didn't think so. Well, that's good. And so the last thing I want to talk to you about, and this is a really serious issue. This is one that, you know, a lot of us, we have been calling attention to for a long time. I remember back 6 and 7 years ago when Common Core and the increased federal pressure to centralize education was coming down in spades. I remember looking at the National Sexuality Standards, this document that was produced about comprehensive sex ed reform, and I knew where this was going to go. We're no longer going to teach human sexuality for 2 weeks in a health class and devote it to biology, birds and bees. The idea of sexuality now is something that kids are going to be exposed to from kindergarten all the way through high school, and they're going to get it in every single class, almost every single subject. And it's not just, again, the mechanics of sex. It's the culture of sex. It's permissive sex. It's the idea that we're encouraging in younger and younger kids that sex is completely amoral. It's just fun. That as long as you are protected in some technologically way, there are no consequences. Talk a little bit about some of your experiences with an out-of-control sexualization in your curriculum.
Well, it wasn't terrible at my school. They did send home a note. It just so happened to mention nothing about sex ed or anything. It just said we were learning about reproductive health. And so my mother didn't actually think to tell me any of that stuff because she didn't know we were going to learn it. And then the first thing I heard was about sex was a detailed description from a substitute teacher in my science class.
And what grade was this?
This was 6th grade.
As early as 6th grade. So you had a substitute teacher in 6th grade science. Were you studying sexuality during that part of the semester? And so this substitute just picked up where your teacher had left off, or was this a complete non sequitur?
This was just, they decided we were doing sex ed.
Okay, on that day, the substitute just decided that's what she was going to talk to you about.
Right.
Okay, and how did that conversation go? What kind of things did the substitute teacher bring in? Were there materials, workbooks, or was this just a conversation you had with a substitute teacher?
Well, the biggest thing that I remember is up on the projector, there was an all-around animation of a naked woman and a naked man. And I remember it was girls and boys were separated, and I remember a lot of the girls were just completely floored by it.
So the substitute teacher segregated the girls and the boys in separate rooms? Is that what happened?
Yes.
And so when you got to see that video, a lot of your classmates were, when you say floored by it, were they upset? Were they embarrassed? Did they find it funny? How did they react to it?
Well, it seemed like a lot of them, also hadn't had this talk with their parents. So this was their first time ever even seeing anything that had to do with this.
And was there anything else? I mean, whether in 6th grade, I know you were a junior in high school now. As you're in high school, have you had more encounters with sexuality education in places that you wouldn't have expected to get it?
Not completely. One thing that I have been informed of, though, is in other places in Indiana where they are having Planned Parenthood representatives come in to teach sex ed, and they're having children act out in role plays different sexual acts and foreplay acts. Thankfully, I was never subjected to that, but it's scary that is happening and it's spreading.
Yeah, we have lots of evidence of Planned Parenthood having a disproportionate impact in the public schools. And parents are not notified. Planned Parenthood representatives from Planned Parenthood are invited in. And because they're not teachers, because they're invited in, they're given much more latitude than a teacher could get away with. And they can skirt around some of the consent issues. I know also there's some talk about legislation in Indiana that is trying to fix the problem by forcing schools to get consent from parents to opt into any of the sexuality talk. But in your situation, and what we're talking about with these Planned Parenthood people, is this was a substitute teacher, right, who there's really no consequence. The school can claim plausible deniability, right? That this substitute teacher did something that we wouldn't have had her do, although the teacher picked up right where she left off, right? It's as if somehow a substitute comes in, triggers this discussion, the teacher says, oh, okay, we weren't going to do that today, or we weren't going to do it at all, but all right, I'll take up from where she left off. Again, all without any consent from mom or dad. And so did you have any conversations with your own parents about what was going on in the school, and how did that go?
Well, when I first got home that first day with the substitute teacher, I came home crying and ended up having to have that discussion with my mother. And she was mad because she didn't completely realize that this was going to happen. And as I've gone through the years, we've had more and more things not necessarily related to that have just come up that were so biased. Like in 8th grade, we used to start out class every day for 10 minutes where we would go onto this website where there was like a game that you would play, and each day there was a different game on how you could stop global warming.
And what was the subject of this class?
This was a science class.
So, all right. So the first 10 minutes of science class, not spent understanding geological time periods or grappling with the intricacies of the universe. You're spending 10 minutes a day for weeks on a time playing how to fight global warming games, basically. Thank you for being such a role model and willing to speak to us today. I hope your story and your courage inspires other kids. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today.
In this corner, your pugilistic pundit, the Duke of Diplomacy, the Professor of Patriotism, the Doctor of Domestic Tranquility.
This is Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke.
And now it's time for Right Makes Might, our weekly segment. And there are so many angles you can take on this school shooting down in Florida. I would just like to isolate one because it's sadly even more in the news now than the shooter himself or the victims. We don't really know anything about the victims of this horrible shooting. We know a lot about the kids that are being manipulated from that school to make political statements. And here's the problem. These young kids, I understand that some of them are traumatized. I understand that they have a voice that needs to be heard. Let's hear it. What I don't understand is why we're granting them in the media, progressive politicians, we're granting them a kind of absolute moral authority about issues like gun control. These are kids who are traumatized by losing a friend. These are not kids that have a broad policy position. They don't have a lot of experience or understanding. And for adult people to not just give them a chance to vent, but then pretend that there's something absolutely moral and necessary that we must act on because what we're hearing from them, that's a little bit dangerous. Take, for instance, the comments of senior Emma Gonzalez from the school, who's talking about the NRA.
Because we keep telling them that if they accept this blood money, they're against the children. They're against the people who are dying. And there's no other way to put it at this point. You're either funding the killers or you are standing with the children. This
idea that somehow like-minded Americans coming together to support an organization that trains and educates people. Yes, do they donate to political causes? Sure they do, just as much as Planned Parenthood does. Unlike Planned Parenthood, who is in the business of actually murdering kids, they don't get $500 million of taxpayer money every year. The NRA does this on its own. This simple binary thinking is not helpful. It's not effective. And you know what it makes it sound? It makes it sound like you're partisan. Because again, I have not heard much from you about the victims. I have not heard much from you about the boy who did the shooting. I have not heard anything from you, Ms. Gonzalez, about the failure of the local police, people with guns. Government-authorized people with guns who could have came in and taken care of this 39 different times, but did not. The fact that you're going to a huge organization like the NRA suggests politicization. And then from David Hogg, another student involved in the story.
And not take money from people that want to keep lessening gun legislation and making it even easier for these horrifying people to get guns. Because if you can't get elected without taking money from child murderers, why are you running?
This is another statement that is remarkably scripted and remarkably similar to the one we just heard, and it makes the same point. You have blood on your hands if you don't call for the immediate disbanding of the NRA. It is political. It is targeted political.
Everything I've heard where we can't do anything and this is just out of our hands is inevitable, I think that's a facade that the GOP is putting up. I think that's what they want us to think. I think that after every shooting, the NRA sends them a memo saying, send your thoughts and prayers, say let's not talk about it now, say this happens. This is the only country where this kind of thing happens.
And this argument, right, that we're the only people who suffer this way, this is the only place that this happens, is a little bit unnerving until you listen to a little bit more. This is actually from an article that Cameron Kasky wrote, an open article that he published at, not surprisingly, CNN. It was written by him. Here's what Mr. Kasky says, quote, "At the end of the day, the students at my school felt one shared experience. Our politicians abandon us by failing to keep guns out of schools. But this time, my classmates and I are going to hold them to account." This time we are going to pressure them to take action. This time we are going to force them to spend more energy protecting human lives than unborn fetuses. Maybe that's why my mind keeps going back to Planned Parenthood. That maybe that's why my mind is suspicious of the fact that it's not necessarily life that matters to these young kids, but certain kinds of life. That Cameron could make a statement like that. That our politicians should spend less time defending the lives of unborn fetuses, and then they'd have more time to spend on the lives of kids in schools, and that means to get rid of guns. This is beginning to sound like a platform, a political platform that any Planned Parenthood supporter would be able to put forth. And then we go to some adults here, right? How about a retired FBI agent Gagliano?
The 1791, the Second Amendment comes online, and here we are in 2018, and we're hanging on to this, and we're going, we just can't talk about this, because if we do that, we're somehow going to tick off the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers could not envision that a 18-year-old kid could go into a gun store. He can't buy beer, but he could buy a semi-automatic weapon, and it's a weapon of war. Dave, we spoke about this. It is a weapon of war.
The Founding Fathers, how old were the kids that fought the Revolutionary War? 15, 16 years old. They were exactly the ones who were given guns at much younger ages to go out and wage war against the King of England, for goodness sake. This whole thing now goes back to what Katie and I discussed at the top of our program earlier. It goes back to this, right? That when you take a tragedy like this that is best understood first, personally, in the mind of the killer, second, culturally, in the very place where it happened, third, philosophically, only then does it rise to the level of politics. If you proceed that way, you don't make stupid statements like that. Excuse me, Mr. FBI agent, you just don't. And that's the problem here. You jump to the highest possible way that progressives can benefit. That's not good for you, and that's not good for me, and that, my friends, is right makes might. Well, we always like to end the Dr. Duke Show with a mild sedative for me, get that blood pressure down, and also with the quote of the day. Today's quote is in honor of the late, great Billy Graham. And the quote reads, Billy speaking of himself, I haven't written my own epitaph, and I'm not sure I should. Whatever it is, I hope it will be simple, and that it will point people not to me, but to the one I served. And if we believe that more, if we recognize that our good deeds point to the higher God, and our bad deeds are on ourselves, we recognize that the best things in life we do are the things that give glory to God. We may not be able to have the impact of a Billy Graham, but we'd be much better people, and our world would be much better for it. This is the Dr. Duke Show. Please feel free to join us on all of your social media platforms. We're on all of them. And if you like the show, give us a holler. We'll see you again next week.